The heavy oak
The monarchy
doors of the
faces an
throne room had
unprecedented
witnessed
crisis. We must
centuries
adapt.
of royal
Your
decisions,
Majesty, what are you proposing?
A new
but
era,
none
Kate.
quite like this.
This life,
King
it's
Charles
not what it
III
seems,
stood
is
at
it?
the massive
No.
windows
But
overlooking
we
the
face it
palace
together.
gardens. His weathered hands
This
clasped
request
behind
defies
his
3
back
centuries of
as
protocol. It
rain
may save the
streaked
crown
ancient
or destroy
glass.
it.
I
Behind
understand
him,
the risk.
the most powerful advisors in the British monarchy sat in stunned
Your
silence around a
Majesty.
mahogany table that had hosted discussions of war,
Kate,
peace,
we need to
and
discuss
empire.
the immediate
The
future of
choice
the
before
monarchy.
them would either
Of course,
save
Your
the
Majesty,
crown
how can I
or
help?
destroy
Parliament
it
is
forever.
in revolt.
Princess Catherine
Your
sat
Majesty, I
perfectly
understand
still
the
in her
gravity
chair,
of this request.
her
The
sapphire
consequences
engagement
will be
ring catching the
irreversible.
dim
It is the
light as
only
she
choice.
processed what had just been asked of her. The same ring that once belonged to Diana, the same ring that symbolized hope for a new generation of royals, now felt impossibly heavy on her finger. The king had just made a request that went against 300 years of royal protocol, tradition, and everything the palace had stood for. In the corner, Prince William's face had gone ashen. His brother Harry's empty chair seemed to mock them all, a reminder of how fractured the royal family had become. The Archbishop of Canterbury shifted uncomfortably, while the Queen Consort Camilla stared at her hands, knowing that what happened in the next few minutes would determine whether her stepson's reign would be remembered as brave or catastrophic. The silence stretched on, thick with the weight of history and consequence. Outside, photographers waited behind palace gates, completely unaware that the woman they had watched grow from a commoner into a princess was about to be offered something that had never been given to anyone like her in the entire history of the British crown. Charles turned slowly from the window, his eyes meeting Kate's across the room. The decision he was about to make public would send shockwaves through Parliament, cause constitutional experts to scramble for precedents that didn't exist, and potentially trigger the biggest crisis the monarchy had faced since the abdication of Edward VIII. But sometimes, when everything is falling apart, the most dangerous choice is also the only one that makes sense. Kate's voice, when she finally spoke, was barely above a whisper, but it carried the power to reshape an empire. "Your Majesty," she said, and the fate of the British crown hung in the balance of her next words. 3 weeks before that fateful meeting in the throne room, Princess Catherine had been living what most people would consider a fairy tale life. She woke up in Kensington Palace to the sound of her children laughing in the gardens below, spent her mornings reviewing charitable commitments, and attended state functions where she smiled gracefully, while diplomats praised her poise and dedication. The British press had largely fallen in love with her, and opinion polls consistently showed her as the most popular member of the royal family after the late Queen Elizabeth. But fairy tales, as Kate had learned over the past 13 years of royal life, often hide darker truths beneath their polished surfaces. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came during a seemingly routine breakfast meeting with King Charles in his private study at Clarence House. Kate had expected to discuss the upcoming Commonwealth Day celebrations and her role in the service at Westminster Abbey. Instead, she found the king pacing behind his desk, surrounded by stacks of official documents, newspaper clippings, and what appeared to be legal briefs. "Catherine," he said without looking up from a particularly thick folder, "we need to discuss the future of the monarchy. Not the distant future, but the immediate future. The next few months, specifically." Kate settled into the leather chair across from his desk, noting the unusual tension in his voice. In all her years of knowing Charles, first as her father-in-law and now as her sovereign, she had rarely seen him this agitated. His normally immaculate appearance showed signs of strain. His tie was slightly askew, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he had been losing sleep. "Of course, Your Majesty. How can I help?" Charles finally stopped pacing and looked at her directly. What she saw in his eyes made her stomach clench with worry. This wasn't the confident king who had waited decades to take the throne. This was a man who looked genuinely frightened. "Parliament is in revolt," he said simply. "Not publicly, not yet. But behind closed doors there are discussions happening that would have been unthinkable just months ago. The Prime Minister came to see me yesterday, and the conversation was unlike any I have ever had with a sitting leader of government." Kate felt a chill run down her spine. The relationship between the Crown and Parliament had been carefully maintained for generations, built on mutual respect and constitutional tradition. If that relationship was fracturing, it meant the very foundation of British government was at risk. "What kind of discussions?" she asked carefully. Charles picked up one of the legal documents from his desk and handed it to her. The letterhead belonged to one of London's most prestigious constitutional law firms. As Kate scanned the dense legal language, certain phrases jumped out at her like warning sirens. Constitutional crisis, parliamentary supremacy, abdication procedures, and most chilling of all, republic transition protocols. "They are seriously considering abolishing the monarchy," Charles said, his voice barely steady, not in some distant future when I am gone, but now. Within the year, possibly within months. Kate set the document down with trembling hands. She had always known that Republican sentiment existed in Britain, but it had seemed like a fringe movement, something that politicians occasionally mentioned to appeal to certain voters, but never seriously pursued. The idea that it had progressed to the point where constitutional lawyers were drafting actual transition documents was almost incomprehensible. But why now? She asked. Your coronation was successful. The public response has been generally positive, and the monarchy's approval ratings are stable. Charles laughed, but there was no humour in it. Stable is not enough anymore, Catherine. The economic situation is deteriorating rapidly. The cost of living crisis has people questioning every public expense, and the royal household represents a very visible target for that frustration. But more than that, there is a fundamental shift happening in how people view authority, tradition, and inherited privilege.
He walked to the window and stared out at the London skyline, where cranes and construction equipment dotted the horizon like mechanical vultures.
The younger generation, particularly those under 30, increasingly see the monarchy as an outdated institution that serves no practical purpose in modern society. They look at other European countries that have abolished their monarchies and see thriving democracies that function perfectly well without kings and queens. Kate processed this information, trying to understand the full scope of what he was telling her. Surely there is still significant support for the monarchy. The polls consistently show majority approval. Polls can change quickly, Charles replied grimly, and they are already shifting. More concerning is what is happening in the Parliament itself. The Prime Minister told me that a growing number of MPs from both major parties are privately expressing doubts about the monarchy's continued relevance. They see it as a potential liability in upcoming elections, especially if economic conditions continue to worsen. The weight of what he was describing began to sink in for Kate. This was not simply a temporary political challenge that could be weathered with careful public relations and a few well-timed charitable appearances. This was an existential threat to an institution that had survived world wars, economic depressions, and massive social upheavals. What triggered this? There must have been some specific incident or series of events. Charles returned to his desk and pulled out a thick folder filled with newspaper clippings and printed social media posts. It started with the expenses review. When the government demanded detailed accounting of royal household spending, they uncovered some unfortunate optics. Nothing illegal or even technically inappropriate, but in the context of widespread economic hardship, certain expenditures appeared tone-deaf. He spread several newspaper headlines across the desk. Royal renovation costs £12 million while food banks struggle. Palace parties cost more than NHS budget increase. King's travel expenses could fund 200 teacher salaries. Kate winced as she read them. Each headline was technically accurate but designed to maximize public outrage. The media had always scrutinized royal spending, but this felt different, more coordinated, more deliberately inflammatory. It gets worse, Charles continued. Someone leaked details of the civil list discussions, including projected costs for the next 5 years. The numbers, while justified from our perspective, look astronomical to people struggling to pay their heating bills. He handed her another document, this one from the Treasury. Kate scanned the projected royal household budget and understood immediately why it had caused such controversy. The numbers were not excessive by historical standards, but in the current economic climate, they represented a public relations disaster. The leaked budget became a rallying point for Republican activists, Charles explained. They organized demonstrations, started online campaigns, and began pressuring MPs to take formal positions on the monarchy's future. What started as general economic frustration focused into specific anti-monarchist sentiment. Kate thought about the recent public engagements she had attended. She had noticed more protesters than usual, and their chants had become more specifically anti-royal rather than generally anti-government. At the time, she had assumed it was simply the normal ebb and flow of public opinion. Now she realized she had been witnessing the early stages of an organized campaign. "How bad is the situation in Parliament?" she asked. Charles's expression darkened further. "Bad enough that the Prime Minister felt obligated to warn me." According to his count, roughly 30% of MPs would support a referendum on abolishing the monarchy if a vote were held today. That number grows to nearly 50% among MPs under age 40. The implications hit Kate like a physical blow. If those numbers continued to trend in the wrong direction, Parliament could potentially force a constitutional crisis that would end centuries of monarchical tradition. Is there any way to reverse this trend? Surely the government has some interest in maintaining stability. The Prime Minister is caught between conflicting pressures, Charles replied. On one hand, he recognizes that abolishing the monarchy would create massive constitutional uncertainty and potentially damage Britain's international reputation. On the other hand, he is facing enormous pressure from his own party to be seen as responsive to public concerns about economic inequality. Charles pulled out his chair and sat down heavily, suddenly looking every one of his 75 years. The most troubling part is that some very intelligent people are beginning to argue that abolishing the monarchy would actually benefit the country economically and politically. They present detailed analyses showing how much money could be saved, how government could be streamlined, and how Britain could project a more egalitarian image internationally. Kate had heard these arguments before, but they had always seemed theoretical. The idea that they were being seriously discussed by people in positions of actual power was deeply unsettling. What does the palace staff think? Surely they have strategies for addressing this kind of challenge. Charles's laugh was bitter. The palace staff is terrified. Half of them are updating their resumes while the other half are in complete denial about the seriousness of the situation. The traditional approaches for managing royal crises simply do not apply to this scenario. He gestured at a stack of memos and reports on his desk. They have proposed everything from increasing charitable activities to modernizing the monarchy's image through social media campaigns. All worthy ideas, but fundamentally inadequate for the scale of the challenge we are facing. Kate understood his frustration. The royal household had generations of experience managing scandals, public relations problems, and political difficulties. But they had never faced the possibility that the institution itself might simply be voted out of existence by a democratic process. The constitutional experts are equally divided, Charles continued. Some argue that Parliament lacks the authority to abolish the monarchy without the Crown's consent, which creates an impossible legal paradox. Others contend that parliamentary supremacy means Parliament can essentially do whatever it wants, including ending the monarchy. The legal uncertainties added another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. Even if the royal family wanted to fight abolition through the courts, it was unclear whether they would have any legal standing to do so. There is something else, Charles said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. The Prime Minister hinted that if public opinion continues to turn against the monarchy, his government might need to actively support abolition to maintain its own political viability. Kate felt the room spinning slightly. The idea that the government itself might turn against the Crown was almost beyond comprehension. Surely he was exaggerating the political pressure he faces. I thought so too, until I saw the polling data he brought with him. Charles handed her another document. This one marked confidential government polling. The numbers were devastating. Support for the monarchy had dropped 15 percentage points in just 6 months, with the steepest declines among working-class voters and people under 35. More alarming were the responses to hypothetical questions about abolition. While most people still expressed general support for the monarchy, a significant minority said they would support abolition if it resulted in meaningful economic benefits for ordinary citizens. The pollsters asked specific questions about trade-offs, Charles explained. Would you support abolishing the monarchy if it meant increased funding for the NHS? Would you support abolition if it meant lower taxes? The results were deeply concerning. Kate studied the polling crosstabs, noting how support for the monarchy correlated with age, income, and education levels. The pattern suggested that demographic changes alone would continue to erode the monarchy's base of support over time, even without any specific political crisis. This is not a problem that will solve itself, Charles concluded. Every month that passes, every economic hardship that ordinary people face, every story about royal expenses or privileges, moves us closer to a point where abolition becomes politically inevitable. The full scope of the crisis was becoming clear to Kate. This was not simply a temporary political storm that could be weathered with patience and careful management. This was a fundamental challenge to the monarchy's continued existence, driven by forces much larger than any individual scandal or controversy. "What options do we have?" she asked, though she was beginning to fear that there might be no good answers. Charles was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that Kate had never heard before. "That, Catherine, is exactly what I need to discuss with you, because the traditional options may not be sufficient for the situation we face. We may need to consider approaches that go far beyond anything the monarchy has ever done before." The meeting ended without Charles explaining what he meant by that cryptic statement. But as Kate walked back to Kensington Palace through the grey London afternoon, she could not shake the feeling that her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. The fairy tale was ending, and she had no idea what would replace it. Kate spent the next 3 days trying to process what King Charles had told her, but normal life made concentration nearly impossible. She had scheduled engagements with 3 different charities, a meeting with the Welsh Assembly about her early childhood initiative, and a state dinner for visiting European dignitaries. Each public appearance required her to smile, make small talk, and project the confident serenity that the British public expected from their future queen. But behind her practiced composure, Kate's mind raced with questions and fears. Every interaction felt surreal, as if she were performing in a play while the theatre burned down around her. When photographers captured her laughing with children at a London hospital, she wondered if those images might someday be among the last official photographs of the British monarchy. The breaking point came on Thursday evening, when William returned home from a week-long tour of Scotland. Kate had been dreading this conversation, unsure how much Charles had told his son about the crisis, and uncertain how William would react to the news that his future inheritance might simply evaporate. They sat in their private sitting room at Kensington Palace after the children had gone to bed, the space illuminated only by a few table lamps and the fire crackling in the Georgian fireplace. William looked exhausted from his tour, but Kate could see the familiar spark of enthusiasm in his eyes as he described the renewable energy projects he had visited in the Highlands. The innovation happening in Scottish wind farming is remarkable, he was saying, and the job creation potential for rural communities could be transformative. I think we should consider making sustainable energy a central focus of our charitable work over the next few years. Kate watched her husband's animated gestures and felt her heart breaking. His optimism about future royal projects seemed almost naive in light of what she now knew. How could she tell him that there might not be a next few years of royal work to plan? "William," she interrupted gently, "we need to talk about something your father told me earlier this week." Something in her tone must have alerted him to the seriousness of the conversation. His expression immediately shifted from enthusiasm to concern. "Is he all right? Is this about his health?" "No, it's not about his health. It's about the monarchy itself." Over the next hour, Kate carefully recounted everything Charles had shared with her, the parliamentary discussions, the polling data, the Prime Minister's warning, and the constitutional lawyer's preparations for potential abolition. William listened in complete silence, his face growing paler with each revelation. When she finished, he sat quietly for several minutes, staring into the fire. Kate could almost see him working through the implications, his trained mind analyzing the political and constitutional ramifications of what she had described. "How long have they been discussing this in Parliament?" he finally asked. "Your father said the serious conversation started about 3 months ago, but the preliminary discussions may have been happening for longer." William stood up abruptly and began pacing, a habit he had inherited from his father. 3 months, and nobody thought to inform the heir to the throne that his inheritance was under active threat? Kate heard the anger in his voice, but also something deeper: hurt. William had spent his entire life preparing for kingship, had sacrificed normal experiences and personal freedom in service of an institution that might not exist when his time came to lead it. "I think your father was trying to shield you from the stress until he had a better understanding of how serious the threat really was." "Shield me?" William's voice rose slightly. "Kate, if Parliament abolishes the monarchy, it doesn't just affect my father's reign. It affects our children's entire future. George will never be king, Charlotte will never be a working royal, Louis will grow up as the younger son of a former prince." The full impact of the crisis hit Kate with new force as William articulated its effects on their family. She had been focused on the immediate political and constitutional challenges, but he was right to think about their children. George, at 10 years old, was already beginning to understand his role as future king. How would they explain to him that everything he had been taught about his destiny might suddenly become irrelevant? "There has to be something we can do," William said, though he sounded more desperate than confident. "Surely the monarchy has faced existential threats before and survived." Kate thought about the historical crises that had tested the crown: the English Civil War, the abdication crisis, the Troubles during the 90s, but all of those had been resolved through dramatic individual actions or political maneuvering. This felt different, more systematic, and harder to counter with traditional royal responses. "Your father seemed to think that conventional approaches would not be sufficient for this situation. He mentioned considering approaches that go beyond anything the monarchy has ever done before." William stopped pacing and looked at her sharply. "What kind of approaches?" He didn't say, but I got the impression he had something specific in mind. Before William could respond, Kate's phone buzzed with a text message from Charles's private secretary. "His Majesty requests your presence at Clarence House tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Prince William should accompany you if possible." William read the message over her shoulder. I suppose we are about to find out what unconventional approaches he had in mind. The next morning arrived grey and drizzling, matching Kate's mood as their car pulled through the gates of Clarence House. She noticed more security than usual, and the staff seemed unusually tense as they were escorted to Charles's study. They found the king waiting with an unexpected group of advisors. In addition to his usual private secretaries, the room included Sir Robert Fellows, a former private secretary to Queen Elizabeth, who had returned to advise Charles during the current crisis. More surprisingly, there was Dr. Sarah Chen, a constitutional law professor from Cambridge, whom Kate recognized from television discussions about political reform. Most shocking of all was the presence of Lord Hardinge, a Labour peer who had been openly critical of the monarchy in the past and had once co-authored a pamphlet titled Republican Britain, A Democratic Future. "Thank you both for coming," Charles said, gesturing for them to take seats around a small conference table. "I realize this is an unusual group, but the situation we face requires us to consider options that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances." William's eyes fixed on Lord Hardinge. "Your Majesty, with respect, why is someone who advocates for abolishing the monarchy participating in discussions about saving it?" Lord Hardinge smiled slightly. "Because, Your Royal Highness, I may be the only person in this room who truly understands the arguments and motivations of those who want to end monarchical government. If you want to counter a movement, you need to understand it from the inside." Dr. Chen opened a thick folder on the table. "We have spent the past month analyzing the constitutional and political challenges facing the monarchy. Our conclusions are sobering, but we believe there may be a path forward that could not only preserve the institution, but actually strengthen it for the future." Kate felt a spark of hope for the first time since learning about the crisis. "What kind of path?" "Before we discuss solutions," Sir Robert interjected, "you need to understand exactly how bad things have become. The polling data His Majesty showed you last week was already out of date." He handed them a new set of documents. The latest numbers were devastating. Support for the monarchy had dropped another 5 percentage points, with particularly steep declines in the north of England and among voters between 25 and 40. "More concerning," Dr. Chen added, "is that opposition to the monarchy is becoming more organized and sophisticated. Republican groups that were once fractured and ineffective are now coordinating their efforts and developing coherent political strategies." Lord Hardinge nodded grimly. "They have learned from successful Republican movements in other countries. They are not simply criticizing the monarchy in abstract terms, but proposing specific alternative systems of government that sound reasonable and practical to ordinary voters." Williams studied the polling data with growing alarm. "How long do we have before this becomes irreversible?" "That depends on several factors," Sir Robert replied. "Economic conditions, political developments, and frankly, how the royal family responds to the crisis. But our best estimate is that you have perhaps 12 to 18 months before Republican sentiment reaches a critical mass that makes abolition politically inevitable." The timeline was much shorter than Kate had expected. 18 months seemed impossibly brief to reverse decades of growing Republican sentiment. "Now," Charles said, "let me explain the approach we believe might save the monarchy, although it would require changes so fundamental that the institution would emerge almost unrecognizable from its current form." Kate felt her pulse quicken. Whatever Charles was about to propose, she sensed it would be radical enough to shock everyone in the room. "The core problem," Chen began, "is that the monarchy is increasingly seen as an expensive, undemocratic relic that serves no essential purpose in modern society. Traditional responses to this criticism have focused on defending the monarchy's historical value and ceremonial functions. But defense alone is not sufficient," Lord Hardinge continued. "People want to see concrete benefits from their institutions, especially during economic hardship. The monarchy needs to demonstrate that it provides unique value that could not be achieved through other means." Sir Robert leaned forward. "We propose transforming the monarchy from a primarily ceremonial institution into something unprecedented, a constitutional monarchy with enhanced democratic legitimacy and expanded powers to address national challenges." Kate was confused. Enhanced democratic legitimacy? How can an hereditary institution become more democratic? "Through voluntary submission to regular democratic approval," Dr. Chen explained. "Imagine a constitutional amendment requiring that the monarch's position be confirmed by national referendum every 10 years. The sovereign would retain the crown only with explicit majority support from the people." William looked stunned. "You are suggesting that Parliament should have the power to vote the monarchy out of existence on a regular schedule." "Not Parliament," Charles corrected. "The people themselves through direct democratic process." This would address the fundamental criticism that monarchy is undemocratic by making it the world's first genuinely democratic monarchy. The concept was so radical that Kate struggled to process its implications. A monarchy that existed only with ongoing popular consent would be unlike anything in human history. But even democratic legitimacy might not be sufficient, Lord Harding cautioned. The institution would also need to justify its existence through practical effectiveness. A purely ceremonial democratic monarchy would still seem wasteful to many voters, which is why we propose expanding the monarch's role beyond ceremony into areas where hereditary tenure might provide unique advantages, Sir Robert explained. Dr. Chen opened another folder. Our analysis suggests that certain governmental functions might actually benefit from being removed from regular political cycles. Long-term planning, infrastructure investment, environmental protection, and international relations all suffer from the short-term thinking that dominates electoral politics. Kate began to see where this was heading, and the implications were staggering. You are proposing that the monarchy take on actual governing responsibilities. Carefully defined and democratically supervised governing responsibilities, Charles clarified. Areas where the monarch's independence from electoral politics and permanent tenure could serve the national interest. William shook his head slowly. This would require completely rewriting the constitutional relationship between the Crown and Parliament. The changes would be unprecedented. Unprecedented times require unprecedented solutions, Lord Harding replied. The alternative is likely abolition within 2 years based on current trends. Sir Robert spread several documents across the table. We have drafted preliminary proposals for what we call enhanced constitutional monarchy. The monarch would retain traditional ceremonial functions while gaining new authority over specified long-term national priorities. Kate scanned the proposals, her mind reeling. The suggested reforms included royal oversight of infrastructure spending, direct monarchical involvement in climate change policy, expanded diplomatic authority, and coordinated management of national economic planning. Parliament would retain ultimate authority through its power to modify the monarch's expanded responsibilities. Dr. Chen explained. But day-to-day governance in specified areas would operate under royal rather than ministerial direction. And the democratic referendum every 10 years would ensure popular approval for this expanded role, Charles added. William was quiet for several minutes, clearly struggling to process the magnitude of what was being proposed. Even if this were constitutionally possible, which I doubt, how could we possibly persuade Parliament to voluntarily surrender significant governmental authority to the Crown? By demonstrating that royal governance in specific areas would produce better outcomes than traditional political management, Lord Harding replied. We would need to prove that enhanced monarchy serves the public interest more effectively than pure parliamentary democracy. Kate realized that what they were discussing was not simply reform of the monarchy, but fundamental transformation of British government itself. The constitutional implications were so vast that she wondered if they were even legally possible. There is one more element to this proposal, Charles said quietly. For enhanced constitutional monarchy to succeed, it would require leadership that combines traditional royal authority with modern democratic sensibilities. It would require a public face that people trust to exercise expanded governmental power responsibly. Something in his tone made Kate look at him more carefully. She saw in his eyes the same expression he had worn when he first told her about the crisis, fear mixed with determination. Your Majesty, she said slowly, what are you asking me to do? Charles's answer would change everything she thought she knew about her role, her future, and the nature of monarchy itself. Charles stood and walked to the tall windows overlooking the garden, his hands clasped behind his back in the gesture Kate had come to recognize as his way of preparing for difficult conversations. The room fell silent except for the steady drumming of rain against the glass. Catherine, he said without turning around, you have spent 13 years proving that you understand both the traditional responsibilities of monarchy and the expectations of modern democratic society. You have managed to maintain public respect while adapting royal protocols to contemporary values. Kate felt a chill of premonition. Your Majesty, I am honored by your confidence, but I am not sure I understand what you are suggesting. Charles turned to face her, and she saw something in his expression that made her stomach clench with anxiety. The enhanced constitutional monarchy we have been discussing would require leadership that the public trusts absolutely. Someone who represents both the dignity of the Crown and the democratic aspirations of the British people. William leaned forward in his chair. Father, what exactly are you proposing? I am proposing, Charles said slowly, that Catherine become the first democratically appointed constitutional monarch in British history. Not through succession, but through direct selection by Parliament, with subsequent approval by national referendum. The words hit Kate like physical blows. She gripped the arms of her chair, struggling to process what she was hearing. Your Majesty, that is impossible. The succession is established by law. Parliament cannot simply set aside the line of succession. Chen spoke up quietly. Actually, Parliament can modify succession laws, as demonstrated by the Succession to the Crown Act 2013. What His Majesty is proposing would require new legislation, but it would not be constitutionally impossible. Kate's mind raced through the implications. You are suggesting that I bypass William and become Queen while he is still alive? That would overturn 1,000 years of monarchical tradition. Quote, not bypass, Charles corrected. William would remain heir to the throne under traditional succession law, but the enhanced constitutional monarchy position would be separate from the historical crown. Think of it as creating a new constitutional role that combines monarchical authority with democratic legitimacy. Sir Robert opened another folder on the table. We have been working with constitutional lawyers to draft the necessary legislation. The traditional monarchy would continue to exist in ceremonial form, while the enhanced constitutional monarchy would exercise the expanded governmental functions we discussed. Kate looked at William, trying to gauge his reaction to this extraordinary proposal. His face was unreadable, but she could see the tension in his posture. So there would be 2 monarchs? William asked. One ceremonial and one functional? Initially, yes, Lord Harding replied. His Majesty would retain the traditional crown, while Catherine would hold the enhanced constitutional position. Over time, the 2 roles might merge, but the initial separation would ease the constitutional transition. Kate stood up abruptly, needing to pace while she processed this information.
Why me?
Why not William? He is the heir to the throne. He has been preparing for leadership his entire life. Charles's expression grew sad. Because William carries the baggage of inherited privilege in a way that you do not. Voters might accept enhanced monarchical authority from someone they see as having earned her position through merit and public service. Also, Dr. Chen added gently, polling data shows that you are significantly more popular than any other member of the royal family, including Prince William. If enhanced constitutional monarchy is to succeed, it needs a leader with maximum public trust. The compliment felt like a burden rather than praise. Kate had worked hard to earn public respect, but she had never imagined that success might lead to this kind of responsibility. What would this enhanced constitutional monarchy actually involve? She asked. What would I be expected to do? Sir Robert spread several detailed documents across the table. The role would combine traditional royal duties with significant governmental responsibilities. You would oversee long-term infrastructure planning, coordinate national climate change policy, manage international trade relationships, and direct economic development initiatives. Kate scanned the documents, her alarm growing with each page. This is not monarchy, this is being head of government. You are asking me to become, essentially, a democratic dictator. Not a dictator, Lord Harding corrected. A constitutional leader with carefully defined powers, subject to parliamentary oversight and regular democratic approval. But yes, the role would involve genuine governmental authority, beyond anything the monarchy has exercised since the 18th century. William had been studying the constitutional proposals. How would this work practically? Would Catherine have a cabinet? Would she answer to Parliament? She would have advisers appointed by Parliament, Dr. Chen explained. And Parliament would retain ultimate authority to modify her powers or remove her from office. But within her defined areas of responsibility, she would operate independently of ministerial direction. Kate sat back down, feeling overwhelmed by the scope of what was being proposed. And you believe that Parliament would actually approve this kind of power transfer? Not the current Parliament, Charles admitted, but if the economic situation continues to deteriorate and public frustration grows, they might be willing to experiment with alternative governance structures. Sir Robert nodded. The key is presenting enhanced constitutional monarchy as a solution to governmental dysfunction, rather than an expansion of royal privilege.
If voters believe it would improve their lives, they might support it.
Kate thought about the practical implications of what they were describing. Even if Parliament approved this and the public supported it, I would need to learn how to actually govern. I have experience with charitable work and public engagement, but managing economic policy or international relations requires expertise I simply do not have. Which is why the transition would be gradual, Lord Harding replied. You would start with limited responsibilities and expand your role as you gained experience. The learning curve would be steep, but we believe you have the intelligence and work ethic to master it. William finally spoke up. What happens to the traditional monarchy if this enhanced constitutional role proves successful? Would the historic crown simply fade into irrelevance? Charles looked uncomfortable with the question. That would depend on how the two roles evolved. It is possible that future constitutional development would merge them into a single democratic monarchy. It is also possible that the traditional crown would be abolished once the enhanced constitutional system proved effective. Kate realized that Charles was potentially proposing the end of his own dynasty's reign. The enhanced constitutional monarchy might begin as a complement to traditional royalty, but if successful, it could eventually replace it entirely. Your Majesty, she said slowly, are you asking me to help you abolish the monarchy in order to save it? Charles smiled sadly. I am asking you to help me transform the monarchy into something that can survive in a democratic age. Whether that transformation preserves the historical institution or replaces it with something new may not matter, as long as the essential function of providing stable, long-term leadership is maintained. The conversation continued for another 2 hours, with the constitutional experts explaining the legal mechanisms for implementing enhanced constitutional monarchy and the political advisors discussing strategies for building parliamentary and public support. But Kate found herself struggling to focus on the details. The fundamental question occupied her entire mind. Was she prepared to accept responsibility for reimagining British government? As the meeting ended and plans were made for follow-up discussions, Kate walked out of Clarence House in a daze. William was quiet during the drive back to Kensington Palace, and she could tell he was as overwhelmed as she was. That evening, after the children were in bed, they sat in their kitchen with cups of tea and tried to make sense of what they had heard. "Do you think it could actually work?" William asked. Kate had been wondering the same thing. The constitutional theory seems sound, assuming Parliament would agree to it, but the practical challenges would be enormous. "Are you seriously considering it?" Kate was quiet for a long time. "I keep thinking about the children. If the monarchy is abolished, what kind of future will they have? George has been raised to believe he will be king someday. How do we explain to him that his destiny has evaporated?" William nodded. On the other hand, if enhanced constitutional monarchy fails, the backlash could destroy not just the traditional monarchy, but our family's reputation permanently. And if I accept this role and prove incompetent, I would be responsible for proving that royal governance is a failed concept. They sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts about an impossible decision. Outside their kitchen windows, London continued its normal rhythm, unaware that the conversation happening in Kensington Palace might determine the future of British democracy itself. Kate's phone buzzed with a text message from Charles's private secretary. "His Majesty requests your answer by the end of the week. Parliamentary discussions are accelerating, and delay may eliminate options. 5 days to decide whether to accept the most radical proposal in the history of the British monarchy." Kate stared at the message until the screen went dark, then looked at William. "What do you think I should do?" "I think," William said quietly, "that you are the only person in our family capable of making this decision. And that terrifies me more than any of the other implications of what we heard today." Kate realized he was right. For the first time since marrying into the royal family, she faced a choice that would define not just her own future, but the future of an institution that had shaped British history for over 1,000 years. And she had absolutely no idea what the right answer might be. The next morning brought news that made the decision even more urgent. The Prime Minister had called an emergency session of Parliament to discuss constitutional reforms necessary to address current economic and political challenges. The public announcement was carefully worded, but Kate understood its real meaning. The government was preparing to move forward, with or without royal cooperation. The monarchy's time for choosing had arrived, whether they were ready or not. Kate spent the next 3 days in a state of near constant anxiety, weighing every possible consequence of the decision before her. She found herself unable to concentrate on normal activities, picking at meals, and lying awake at night staring at the ceiling while William slept fitfully beside her. The impossibility of the situation became clearer with each passing hour. Accepting Charles's proposal would mean taking on governmental responsibilities she had never trained for, risking the failure that could discredit constitutional monarchy forever. Refusing it would likely mean watching the traditional monarchy be abolished within months, leaving her children to grow up as former royals in a Republican Britain. On Wednesday morning, she made a decision that surprised even herself. She called Lord Hardinge and asked if they could meet privately. If she was going to consider fundamentally changing the British system of government, she needed to understand the Republican perspective from someone who had spent years advocating for abolition. They met at his London flat, a surprisingly modest apartment filled with political biographies and constitutional law texts. Lord Hardinge greeted her warmly but with obvious curiosity about why the future Queen Consort would seek private counsel from one of the monarchy's most articulate critics. "Your Lordship," Kate began, settling into a leather chair in his study. "I need to ask you a direct question. Do you genuinely believe that enhanced constitutional monarchy could work, or is this elaborate proposal simply a way to ease the transition toward republicanism?" Lord Hardinge smiled appreciatively. "That is exactly the right question to ask. And the honest answer is that I am not entirely certain." His candor surprised her. "Then why are you supporting it?" "Because the status quo is unsustainable," he replied simply. "Traditional monarchy cannot survive modern democratic scrutiny. But I have come to believe that the complete abolition of monarchical institutions might eliminate beneficial elements that pure parliamentary democracy cannot replace." Kate leaned forward. "What beneficial elements?" Lord Hardinge stood and walked to his bookshelf, pulling out a thick volume on comparative government. "Democratic systems excel at representing short-term popular preferences, but they struggle with long-term planning and politically difficult decisions. Elected officials naturally focus on the next election cycle rather than the next generation." He opened the book to a chapter comparing democratic and monarchical decision-making patterns. Hereditary leaders, freed from electoral pressures, can potentially make decisions based on long-term national interest rather than immediate political advantage. Kate had never heard the case for monarchy made in such pragmatic terms, but surely elected leaders can also consider long-term consequences. "They can, but the systemic incentives work against it," Lord Hardinge replied. "Consider climate change policy. Everyone agrees it requires difficult short-term sacrifices for long-term benefits, but democratic politicians who impose those sacrifices often lose elections to opponents promising immediate relief." The logic was compelling, but Kate remained skeptical. How do we know that monarchical decision-making would be better? Historical evidence suggests that hereditary rulers are just as likely to make poor choices as elected ones. "Absolutely correct," Lord Hardinge agreed, "which is why enhanced constitutional monarchy includes democratic oversight and regular approval. We would gain the potential benefits of long-term thinking while maintaining democratic control over outcomes." Kate studied the constitutional diagrams in his book, trying to visualize how this hybrid system would function in practice. What happens if the enhanced constitutional monarch makes decisions that prove unpopular or harmful? Parliament retains the power to override any monarchical decision with a 2/3 majority vote, Lord Hardinge explained. And of course, the 10-year referendum process allows voters to remove an ineffective monarch entirely. The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, with Lord Hardinge explaining his evolution from Republican advocate to supporter of democratic monarchy. His arguments were intellectually persuasive, but Kate left his flat with even more questions than answers. That afternoon brought another complication. A call from the Prime Minister's office requesting an urgent meeting with both Kate and William. The tone of the request suggested that the government was no longer willing to wait for royal deliberations. They met the Prime Minister at Downing Street, in the same room where countless critical decisions about British governance had been made. The PM looked exhausted and stressed, clearly feeling the pressure of managing both the economic crisis and a potential constitutional revolution simultaneously. "Your Royal Highnesses," he began without preamble, "I need to inform you about developments in Parliament that affect the choices facing the royal family." Kate felt her stomach tighten. "What kind of developments?" 3 separate groups of MPs have introduced legislation related to constitutional reform," the Prime Minister replied. "One proposes a referendum on abolishing the monarchy entirely, another calls for dramatic reduction in royal funding and authority. The third, interestingly, proposes something very similar to the enhanced constitutional monarchy that His Majesty discussed with you." William exchanged glances with Kate. "How much support do these proposals have?" "Too much," the PM replied grimly. "Any one of them could potentially pass if brought to a vote today. The political momentum for constitutional change has reached a critical mass." Kate realized that their private royal deliberations were being overtaken by public political events. "What is your position on these proposals?" The Prime Minister was quiet for a moment, clearly choosing his words carefully. "My government's primary responsibility is maintaining political stability while addressing the economic challenges facing the country. If constitutional reform can serve those goals, we will support it." The careful diplomatic language did not hide his meaning. The government would support whichever option seemed most likely to succeed politically, regardless of royal preferences. How much time do we have before Parliament votes on these proposals? William asked. The earliest vote could come within 2 weeks, the PM replied. I wanted to give you advance warning because the outcome will obviously affect your family's future significantly. As they drove back to Kensington Palace, Kate felt the weight of approaching deadlines. The leisurely deliberation she had hoped for was being compressed into days or even hours. That evening, she called Charles and asked for an emergency family meeting. They gathered in the drawing room at Clarence's house. Charles, Camilla, William, Kate, and surprisingly, Princess Anne, who had been briefed on the crisis earlier that day. The political situation is moving faster than we anticipated, Charles began. We need to make decisions now rather than continuing to deliberate. Princess Anne, characteristically direct, cut to the heart of the matter. Catherine, are you prepared to accept the enhanced constitutional monarchy role, or should we begin planning for life as former royals? The bluntness of the question forced Kate to confront the decision she had been avoiding. I honestly do not know if I am qualified for such responsibility. None of us were qualified for our roles when we began, Camilla said quietly. Royal duty has always involved learning on the job while managing public scrutiny. Charles nodded. The difference is that traditional royal roles have been largely ceremonial for generations. What we are proposing would require you to exercise real governmental authority. Kate looked around the room at faces that had become family over 13 years of marriage to William. These people had supported her through every challenge of royal life, but this decision was hers alone to make.
If I accept this role and fail, she said slowly, I would not just damage my own reputation.
I would prove to the world that monarchy is incompatible with effective governance. William reached over and took her hand. And if you succeed, you might create a new model for constitutional democracy that other countries could follow. Princess Anne leaned forward. The question is not whether you might fail. The question is what happens if you do not try. Parliament will pass constitutional reform, with or without our input. At least this way, we have some control over the outcome. Kate realized that Anne was right. The choice was not between accepting responsibility and maintaining the status quo. The choice was between attempting to guide constitutional change and allowing it to happen without royal involvement. What would be my first priority if I accepted this role, she asked Charles. Demonstrating that enhanced constitutional monarchy can address problems that traditional democratic politics cannot solve. He replied, you would need to choose an initial focus area where monarchical authority could produce tangible improvements in people's lives. Kate thought about the social and economic challenges facing Britain: housing shortages, climate change, economic inequality, infrastructure decay, and declining international competitiveness. Any of these problems could serve as a test case for enhanced monarchical governance. How would I build a team? I would need advisors with expertise I lack. Parliament would approve a constitutional council to support you, Charles explained. The key would be selecting people based on competence rather than political loyalty. Kate walked to the window and looked out at the London skyline, thinking about the millions of people whose lives would be affected by whatever decision she made. The traditional monarchy had served them for centuries through wars, economic crises, and social transformations. But perhaps the time had come for something new. She turned back to face her family. If I do this, I need your complete support. Not just public endorsement, but genuine help navigating challenges I have never faced. You would have it, William said immediately. Charles stood and approached her. Catherine, you have already proven that you can adapt royal traditions to contemporary expectations while maintaining their essential dignity. Enhanced constitutional monarchy would simply extend that approach to governmental leadership. Kate looked at each of them one more time, searching their faces for any doubt or uncertainty about what they were asking her to do. She saw anxiety, hope, and determination, but no doubt. All right, she said quietly. I accept. The room fell silent for a moment, as if everyone was processing the historical significance of what had just been decided. Then Charles smiled, and Kate saw relief wash over his features. Thank you, Catherine. I believe you may have just saved the monarchy by agreeing to transform it completely. As Kate drove home that night, she realized that her life had just changed as dramatically as when she first married William 14 years earlier. But this time, instead of adapting to existing royal traditions, she would be creating new ones. The easy part was over. Now she had to prove that a democratic monarchy could actually work. The throne room at Buckingham Palace had never hosted a meeting quite like this one. Within 48 hours of Kate's acceptance, Charles had assembled what could only be described as the most unlikely constitutional convention in British history. The mahogany table that had once hosted war cabinets and diplomatic summits now surrounded representatives from across the political spectrum, all united by the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them together. Kate sat perfectly still in the chair that would soon become symbolically hers, watching as the most powerful people in Britain prepared to vote on a proposal that would either save the monarchy or destroy it in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. The weight of the moment pressed down on her like a physical force, making it difficult to breathe normally. Prime Minister Sarah Henderson sat at the far end of the table, her usual political composure showing cracks of strain after 3 sleepless nights of coalition building. Next to her, the leader of the opposition looked equally exhausted but grimly determined to see the process through. Constitutional experts flanked both sides, their briefing folders thick with legal precedents that might or might not apply to what they were attempting. The Archbishop of Canterbury occupied his traditional place as the spiritual advisor to the Crown, though even he seemed uncertain about the religious implications of creating a democratically chosen monarch. Palace staff lined the walls, their faces betraying a mixture of excitement and terror at witnessing the potential end of everything they had dedicated their careers to serving. But it was Charles himself who commanded the room's attention. The king sat at the head of the table with the bearing of a man who had finally stopped fighting an impossible situation and chosen to embrace the only solution that might work. His voice was steady as he formally opened the session that would determine the future of British constitutional monarchy. Ladies and gentlemen, we are gathered here to consider a proposal that goes beyond constitutional reform into the realm of governmental revolution. The Enhanced Constitutional Monarchy Act represents the most significant change to British governance since the English Civil War. Kate watched the faces around the table as Charles spoke. Some looked intrigued, others skeptical. A few appeared genuinely frightened by what they were contemplating. All understood that they were participating in a moment that would be analysed by historians for centuries to come. Before we proceed, Charles continued, I want to ensure that everyone understands exactly what we are proposing. This is not simply an expansion of royal authority or a modernisation of ceremonial functions. We are creating an entirely new constitutional role that combines monarchical independence with democratic legitimacy. Dr. Sarah Chen stood to address the gathering, her academic credentials lending gravity to what might otherwise seem like a political fantasy. The enhanced constitutional monarchy would operate under 3 fundamental principles: democratic selection, parliamentary oversight, and regular public approval through referendum. She activated a presentation screen showing the proposed governmental structure. The enhanced constitutional monarchy would be chosen by Parliament through a process similar to selecting a Speaker of the House, then confirmed by national referendum. The role would carry significant executive authority over specified policy areas, but always subject to parliamentary review and constitutional limits. Kate listened to Dr. Chen explain the legal mechanisms that would govern her potential new role, marveling at how academic theories were being transformed into practical governmental structures. The constitutional scholars had worked through countless details over the past weeks, creating a framework that was both revolutionary and surprisingly practical. Lord Hardinge took over the presentation to address political concerns. The key insight driving this proposal is that democratic governance requires both responsiveness to public opinion and independence from short-term political pressures. Traditional monarchy provides independence but lacks democratic legitimacy. Pure parliamentary democracy provides legitimacy but struggles with long-term planning. He clicked to a slide showing comparative government effectiveness across different political systems. Enhanced constitutional monarchy attempts to capture the benefits of both approaches while minimizing their weaknesses. Prime Minister Henderson raised her hand. Lord Hardinge, this is intellectually fascinating, but how do we address practical concerns about implementation? We are asking the Parliament to voluntarily transfer significant authority to an institution that has been purely ceremonial for generations. The question Kate had been dreading hung in the air. Everyone in the room understood the theoretical appeal of the proposal, but politics was about practical power, not constitutional theory. Charles answered before Lord Hardinge could respond. Prime Minister, the current system is failing. Economic inequality is growing, infrastructure is deteriorating, climate change requires long-term policies that electoral cycles cannot support, and public faith in democratic institutions is declining rapidly. He gestured toward a stack of economic reports. Traditional parliamentary governance, constrained by election cycles and partisan politics, has proven inadequate for addressing these challenges. Enhanced constitutional monarchy offers a way to maintain democratic control while enabling more effective long-term governance. The leader of the opposition leaned forward. Your Majesty, with respect, why should we believe that royal governance would be more effective than elected government? Historical evidence suggests that hereditary rulers are just as prone to poor decision-making as elected officials. Kate realized this was her moment to speak. The question went to the heart of why she, specifically, might succeed where traditional governance had failed. "You raise the essential point," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "I am not asking for authority based on hereditary right or constitutional tradition. I am proposing to earn governmental responsibility through demonstrated competence and democratic approval." She stood, feeling the weight of every gaze in the room. The enhanced constitutional monarchy position would not be inherited. It would be performance-based. If I prove incompetent or lose public support, Parliament can remove me and the experiment ends. Prime Minister Henderson nodded slowly. Princess Catherine, assuming Parliament approves this proposal and you are confirmed by referendum, what would be your immediate priorities? Kate had spent days preparing for this question, knowing that her answer would largely determine whether the proposal gained political support. "I would focus initially on long-term infrastructure development, particularly renewable energy and transportation systems that require planning horizons beyond normal electoral cycles." She activated her own presentation, showing detailed policy proposals developed with expert advisors over the previous week. These areas represent clear examples of problems that democratic politics struggles to address effectively due to short-term electoral pressures. The Speaker of the House studied the policy documents.
How would you staff this new governmental role?
Enhanced constitutional monarchy would require expertise that traditional royal households do not possess. Parliament would approve a constitutional council composed of experts selected through merit-based processes rather than political appointment, Kate replied. The council would provide technical expertise while maintaining democratic accountability through parliamentary oversight. For the next 3 hours, the discussion continued with increasing intensity. Constitutional lawyers debated legal precedents, political scientists analyzed governmental effectiveness, and elected officials wrestled with the practical implications of transferring executive authority to a democratically chosen monarch. Kate found herself answering increasingly detailed questions about policy implementation, international relations, and economic management. Each answer revealed how much she had learned during her crash course in governmental theory over the past weeks, but also how much she still needed to master. As the afternoon progressed, something remarkable began to happen. The initial skepticism in the room gradually gave way to serious engagement with the practical possibilities of enhanced constitutional monarchy. Politicians who had entered the meeting as reluctant participants began offering suggestions for implementation rather than simply raising objections. The turning point came when the Prime Minister asked a direct question that had been hovering over the entire discussion. If we proceed with this proposal and it succeeds, what happens to traditional monarchy? Charles answered with a candor that surprised everyone. Traditional ceremonial monarchy would likely become obsolete over time. Enhanced constitutional monarchy represents evolution rather than mere reform. We are not trying to save the old institution, we are trying to create a new one that serves contemporary needs. The honesty was breathtaking. The king was acknowledging that he might be presiding over the end of a 1,000-year-old tradition in order to create something entirely unprecedented. Princess Anne, who had remained silent throughout most of the meeting, spoke up for the first time. The fundamental question is whether we want constitutional change to happen with royal involvement or without it. Parliament has the power to abolish monarchy entirely. At least this approach gives us some control over our institutional future. Her blunt assessment focused the room's attention on the political reality underlying all their theoretical discussions. Constitutional change was coming, whether the royal family participated or not. The only question was what form it would take. As evening approached, Charles called for a formal vote on proceeding with the Enhanced Constitutional Monarchy Act. The process was symbolic rather than legally binding, but it would signal whether the proposal had sufficient political support to move forward. Kate watched as hands rose around the table in support of the motion. Prime Minister Henderson voted yes. The leader of the opposition, after a long moment of hesitation, also raised his hand. Constitutional experts, political advisors, and even some of the more traditional palace staff indicated their support. When the count was complete, the Enhanced Constitutional Monarchy Act had received approval from more than 2/3 of those present. The proposal would move forward to Parliament for formal consideration. Charles stood to formally close the historic session. This concludes the most important constitutional discussion in British history since the establishment of parliamentary supremacy. What we have agreed to attempt has never been tried before by any nation. He looked directly at Kate. Princess Catherine, Parliament will now consider legislation that could make you the first democratically chosen constitutional monarch in world history. Are you prepared for that responsibility? Kate felt the weight of the moment settle over her like a mantle. Every person in the room, every member of Parliament, every citizen of the United Kingdom would be watching to see if she could prove that monarchy could adapt to serve democratic societies. Yes, Your Majesty, I am prepared. As the meeting dispersed and participants filed out of the throne room, Kate remained seated at the table, looking around at the ancient space that had witnessed so many pivotal moments in British history. In a few weeks, this room might host her selection as enhanced constitutional monarch, or it might host the final ceremonial functions of a monarchy being abolished entirely. William appeared beside her chair and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. How do you feel? Kate considered the question carefully. Terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. We have either just saved the monarchy by completely transforming it, or we have created the most elaborate method of institutional suicide in political history. And which do you think it is? Kate stood and took one last look around the throne room before walking toward the doors. I suppose we will find out together. 3 weeks later, in this same room, Kate would be formally selected by Parliament as the first enhanced constitutional monarch in British history. The palace would fall silent not because the monarchy was ending, but because it was beginning something entirely new. The fairy tale was over, but the real story was just beginning.